Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to the 51st Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning.
Good morning.
Do you know the words to the chorus of O Come All Ye Faithful?
I do, yes.
Would you like to sing them for us?
I'm not going to sing because my singing is too bad, but I do know the words.
But I think, having read your piece in the Sunday Telegraph yesterday, where you said your brother actually puts his hand over his ears at the sound of your
It was just one
warbling.
ear. It was like this. I mean, not that people listening can tell. It was just one ear. The person on the other side is probably.
Are you
very
really sure? I
nicely.
felt that we should put this to the listeners so they should be the judge.
I think best not. I think I wouldn't wish to offend your listeners' ears.
Because they are very simple. It's simply, "O come, let us adore him,
O come.
Christ."
Well, very quiet to the first.
Could you
couple
do it
of times.
quietly?
in accordance with regulations? No, but it's the first two goes are very quiet, and then you can boom it out the third time.
I won't ask you to boom it out the third
No.
time. So you reluctantly refuse to be drawn. Let's see if you can be drawn by a quite different sort of question, which is the Conservative manifesto said, "We will proudly," my italics, "maintain our commitment to spend 0.7 of GDP on development." And
Pride cometh before destruction, and haughty spirit before a fall. Absolutely, but circumstances have fundamentally changed.
And they fundamentally changed because
Because of the expenditure that's had to be taken on to deal with the COVID crisis. And I think the country at large would think it was unreasonable to be spending very large amounts of money on overseas aid when the country is facing a serious economic crisis and huge costs because of COVID. And so you've got a situation where we will still be a very major supporter of overseas aid, but some saving is being made, which is only right and proper.
I understand the point about the finance, but the Chancellor made a point in his statement of saying that departmental budgets are going to be increased at the fastest rate for 15 years. And perhaps you can point one out to me. I couldn't see another area cut in his proposals, so to speak, other than public sector pay, in part.
Well, but public sector pay is a very major part of the total cost of government, as you know, that in almost every department, the biggest single factor is pay rather than any other cost. So keeping public sector pay under control in a circumstance where the public sector has gone up by 4% over the last year and the private sector down by 1% is again a reasonable thing to be doing under circumstances whilst protecting the lowest paid in the public sector. So there's that overall activity. However, in terms of infrastructure expenditure, we need the new roads, we need the rollout of superfast fibre to ensure that we have a competitive economy and can recover from this very serious downturn. And I think as a sort of economic discussion, this is the point in a very long cycle when Keynesianism is the right answer. Why would I say that? Because what has happened is that you have had a collapse in demand induced by government decree, and we need to get that demand back up. So the government, having cut the demand, is now helping to restore the demand, having maintained the supply, by and large. Keynesianism went wrong because people thought that Keynesianism was always the answer to any downturn, regardless of the cause of the downturn or the public finances at the time. And Keynes was well aware of this himself. He said in an interview not long before he died that when asked what if governments carried on spending money when economic times weren't so bad, he said, well, he would make a speech in the House of Lords and point this out to them. But of course he didn't live long enough to have the opportunity to make those speeches in the House of Lords that might have been very helpful in the 50s, 60s and 70s.
I'm sure you're right on the Keynesian point, but that takes us back to where this discussion started, which is why this Keynesian type programme should overseas aid be the only substantial budget reduced. Contrary to the manifesto, is it really simply because it's got less support from voters and that's an end of it?
It's because in terms of Keynesian expenditure, overseas aid has no direct benefit to an economy that is seriously stressed. Does it? Because the money, and I'm not a mercantilist by any means, but that spending an extra few £billion overseas has no direct economic benefit to the UK, unless you invest it rather than spend it.
But presumably some of the spending goes on the people here who will be providing the aid abroad.
A little bit, but that's marginal. So I think it makes economic sense. I think it's absolutely reasonable, and you can't afford to do everything that you want to do all the time. And the crisis that took place and is continuing to take place has had an enormous economic impact, and therefore I think it is right to be reducing the overseas aid budget. It's a policy I completely support.
So under what circumstances is it right to break a manifesto pledge?
It's a very good question. It's obvious, isn't it? Otherwise you wouldn't have asked it. That's why we have these conversations, so you can ask these brilliant questions. I think manifesto pledges are the intention of what a government will do and how it seeks to govern, and that they are very, very important as symbols of good faith and symbols of the underlying philosophy of the party that seeks to govern. So what are we saying about what underlies the promise to maintain overseas aid at 0.7% is that we are committed to being a globalist UK. And I would suggest that that globalist approach is being more than supported by the extra expenditure for the Ministry of Defence, because some of the way aid is delivered is by using our armed forces or by doing things like peacekeeping, which don't technically count under the OECD definition. And so if you look at it in the round, the broad promise that we were giving to the electorate is being upheld, that we are maintaining a globalist approach. The absolute detail, one point of it is going to be missed. And so I think it's very important to maintain manifesto commitments. I think it's an indication of your direction of travel, of your underlying philosophy. But I also recognise that sometimes a specific detail may simply be too difficult to maintain. However, it's not to think that there aren't consequences, because you will remember, read my lips, no new taxes. And George Bush Sr. said this again and again and again. And then when it came to the Gulf War and the economic downturn, he broke his promise and he lost the ensuing election. And so no sensible party or government ever breaks manifesto commitments willy-nilly. It needs extraordinary circumstances, and your point's absolutely spot on. It also needs public consent, as does all government in reality, to understand that it is a reasonable thing to do. And I think that public consent is there.
I mean, just one last question on this, just following by analogy. There's a pledge in the manifesto, rather a central one actually, not to put income tax up. But by your argument, one could get around that by putting up the thresholds rather than the rates.
I've never thought manifestos work in that way. I don't think voters read them and say, they're not going to put the rates up, but that allows them to do everything else other than put the rates up. I think they look at the headline promise and they say that means that taxes are not going to be, income tax is not going to be put up. And I think when governments get into doing that, which New Labour was absolutely expert at, it undermines trust in politics, let alone in the party who does it. It's a mistake to think that you can follow the letter of a manifesto promise and not the spirit of it, because most people don't read every page of a manifesto. It's like the mistake we made in 1992, when we went round saying we had no need and no plans to raise taxes. And immediately after the election, we discovered a need and developed a plan. The electorate were not impressed by that. And although I think the ERM problem was the greater reason for our failure in 1997, the no need and no plans becoming a need and a plan was part of the undermining of trust in the Conservatives in the 92 to 97 period.
That could take us back to the aid pledge, but you've dealt with that very fully, so let's move on. I've just got to one supplementary. Do you think there will be a need to raise taxes later in the Parliament?
I don't know. I think a lot of the costs from the coronavirus will be one-off costs, which will not recur. There will be some effect on the economy, which is hard to quantify. And there needs to be a judgment made as to whether increased taxation would stifle economic growth in a way that would mean that in the end there was less money for public services than if you encouraged economic growth. So I think you may even have written about this. I think a pro-growth policy is what we actually need, and leaving the European Union is part of the ability to do that we are much freer than we were whilst members of the European Union and in the transition period. So I think we'll have to wait and see, but that recognising that a lot of the expenditure is one-off, that there are supply-side reforms that are in the pipeline, including on planning, which I think is of fundamental importance. If we can free up the economy, if the economy can grow, then I think there is a good prospect of tax rises not being necessary.
That suggests you think they won't be necessary next spring. We know where we are on the spending side now because the Chancellor's laid that out in the spending growth. Going towards the budget, that would either mean tax rises to reduce this deficit, or one tries to grow one's way out of it, which means no major tax rises.
Well, look, you know, it's not for me to try and influence what the Chancellor's going to do. It's a matter for him. So it's best if I talk about these things in general economic terms rather than in the specifics. But I think that most people would agree that at the point at which an economy is coming out of an extraordinarily deep slump, that is not the time when you want to slap the economy down with higher taxes. I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to say.
Let's hope not, or let's hope so, depending on which side of the table one's sitting on. Tomorrow, today, in fact, I reprove myself, it's today, as our listeners hear it, is the coronavirus vote. But obviously I'm asking this question yesterday, Monday, which is today for me asking the question. Before I confuse the listeners further, vote on Tuesday evening. When will the next vote be on tiering? Well,
the Prime Minister said there will be another vote in the new year, but the tiering will be reviewed every fortnight. And the government has committed to there being a vote on matters of national significance. So it depends whether there are any matters of national significance that come before the potential vote in either late January or early February.
So there'd be a vote at the end of February?
No, I think at the end of January or early February. I don't think it'd be as late as the end of February.
So just to be clear, vote Tuesday evening, today, as our listeners are listening, and then another vote at the end of
the Prime Minister's
January.
Written to Conservative MPs setting out this timetable for other votes, but it's important to remember that the government committed some time ago to holding votes on any changes that are matters of national significance.
Well, that of course would depend how that was defined, but I think what a lot of Conservative MPs are asking for, as you well know, being leader of the House, is another vote like this one before next April. And, you know, I'd stick my neck out and say if the government didn't concede that, you'd be in danger of the vote passing, the measure passing on Labour votes, assuming Labour vote for it. If a vote comes earlier, the situation might well be different.
There's been a lot of talk about the measure passing on Labour votes. It won't do that, whatever happens. The majority of the Conservative Party will vote for the restrictions and for the tiers.
The majority will, but
Of the
if-
Conservative
if-
Party.
Yeah.
I know what you're meaning, that if the Labour Party opposed it,
Quite.
but that's not quite the same as it getting through on Labour votes. Labour could abstain and it would still get through, or Labour could support it. But
If 60 of the colleagues voted against it, you'd be reliant
and you'd be reliant on opposition
to
parties,
get it through.
at least abstaining, not necessarily supporting.
What do you think they will do, by the way?
The Labour Party? It's a very interesting question. The Labour Party instinctively likes telling people what to do. That's what socialists like doing. It's in their DNA, isn't it, to boss people about. So their natural instinct is to have strict lockdowns and as strict as they possibly can. And yet they may see a political advantage in opposing the government. So it will be a battle between their natural authoritarian instincts and their political opportunism, and we will see which wins.
I was thinking about it in this context that Starmer twice over has, if I read the papers rightly, got to persuade his MPs not to vote against a major Conservative proposal. One is the coronavirus. The second, if there is a Brexit deal, is a Brexit deal. And I just wondered if persuading them to abstain twice or vote with the government twice or vote with the government once and abstain once really was a bit of a big ask.
I mean, I think it's much harder for them on Brexit because they don't like it, rather than on lockdown, which they love. The Labour Party would have us all our lives run by them permanently. The Labour Party believes the man in Whitehall really does know best. We've always believed that. They love regulating people.
And so we've, I think, dealt with this matter of the vote. It looks as though there'll be a second vote on the tiers long before April, which some of your colleagues have been asking for. The famous cost-benefit analysis is apparently about to arrive. Could I just ask you on one more point where actually I think the government's got a reasonable case? It's this, nothing is exasperating the colleagues more, it seems to me, than the fact that they might be in a seat where the virus rates are very low. They're next door to a seat where the rates are very high, or a city or town where the rates are very high. And they're being lumped in, and they are furious about it. And it's this that is driving much of the dissatisfaction.
Yes, but I'm afraid this is a bit where I fundamentally disagree, because we are a nation of counties. That there is a real sense of county for most people in this country. I mean, it's not true for Middlesex anymore, but for Kent, for Somerset, for Cornwall, for Yorkshire, there is a sense of county. And that's really important because you want to have manageable building blocks for the tiers. It makes no sense to do it village by village or hamlet by hamlet. And parliamentary constituencies are arbitrary lines drawn on a map to find a certain population for a general election. Currently within counties, but in the reforms that have just gone for royal assent, either just got it or just about to get it, they will straddle county boundaries more often. But the county has an ancient logic to it, very often some form of physical barrier, a river, a range of hills, a natural boundary, but also, most importantly, a societal boundary. Particularly when you get out of central London and the immediate area around London, the London suburbs, people feel that their county is an important part of who they are. Indeed, I think most people in England think of themselves as being British and of their county. And therefore having restrictions that are on a county level goes with the grain of British society. And as all restrictions, all government action relies on the consent of the governed. To do it in a way that goes with the grain of human understanding seems to me to be right.
At the end of Lark Rise to Candleford, the author mourns the arrival of the motor car. It's speeded up communications between places. And in the government's defence, we don't live in the world of Lark Rise to Candleford where people can move at no greater speed than that afforded by a horse. And people do move in cars between different constituencies and places. So I can see why the government's got a point. 30 years since the fall of Margaret Thatcher. Did you remember her?
Yes,
as a child?
Indeed. Of course I do, yes. I remember her becoming leader of the party. I was only 6 at the time, but it was the major topic of family conversation.
Did you meet her? You must have.
Yes,
met her.
I met her. I didn't meet her as Prime Minister, but I met her a number of times after she'd left office, and was always, even in her very old age, always amazed by this really remarkable personality. Early on, when I first met her, she'd only just left office, and there was this incredible force. And then in her very old age, there was this beautiful underlying gentleness, goodness.
When you met her just after she'd left office and you felt this force, do you remember what you were talking about?
Well, I remember one thing particularly, yes. She was thinking of finding a country place to live in, because obviously she'd lost Chequers, and she absolutely adored Chequers. And she was saying the problem is the traffic getting out of London is so difficult and takes such a long time. And I said to her, but Mrs. Thatcher, as she still was, don't you have outriders, and can't you be whizzed through? And she said to me, this is a democracy. She wasn't having any of that nonsense. And I thought this was so important, because there she was, this great leader, amazing leader. And she was saying, look, I'm no longer Prime Minister. I don't get that special treatment because this is a democracy. And that has always remained with me. One has to remember that politicians are there to serve and are part of the democratic effort, not in any sense above it.
Do you think it would have been better if she'd sort of gone straight away after 10 years at the sort of height of her powers, rather than wait and expose herself to what came
No,
later?
I think it would be better if she'd survived and carried on.
And all that.
And all that. I mean, I think what we got afterwards wasn't particularly great, was it? Took us to our largest defeat in our modern political history in 1997.
According to Charles Moore, your advice wasn't the same as Dennis Thatcher's. Dennis Thatcher thought she should go. And Charles said in a talk he gave recently that Margaret Thatcher kept saying, no, you see, I can't go on this date because it'd be very awkward for the Queen, because knowing that no one could possibly challenge any conversation that she'd had with the Queen. So on she went to the...
But she was brilliant at it, and really transformed the country. So much that we're still benefiting from was done by her, including actually leaving the European Union. We'd never have got around to leaving the European Union if she hadn't started that argument over money at the beginning of her time, and resetting the base of our membership and setting out why we were in it as an economic transaction quite clearly. And if the economic transaction failed, we were going to leave. Also, the fact that she was overruled on the ERM began the beginnings of the end of the EU being a successful body for the UK to belong to.
Do you think it was Europe that did for her with the Parliamentary Party, or the poll tax, or was it simply that in some deep way they got fed up with her?
Probably the latter. I think Europe, reading Charles Moore's brilliant biography, I mean, it is so good and gripping. I think Europe is fundamental. And also, she didn't have around her people who actually supported her. I mean, if you think the Chief Whip didn't vote for her in the ballot against Heseltine, I think he abstained. But that's really extraordinary. And I think by the time she left, she no longer had allies around her who were willing to go into bat for her. She'd fallen out with them, they'd left, they'd retired, and she didn't have that core of support who were running the Parliamentary Party for her.
Just a last question. Margaret Thatcher, Europe. I'm not going to ask you whether we'll have a Brexit trade deal or not. What's the timetable? How much longer have we got to agree one?
That's a very good question, a very difficult question for me, because with the Chief Whip, it's my responsibility to try and get any legislation through Parliament. We have very little time to get it through Parliament, assuming that people don't want to form a bubble with other members of Parliament over Christmas and sit on Christmas Day, which I think we last did in 1656 under the usurper Cromwell. So I think we've got very little time. I think we have got this week, but bear in mind we've got other bills and we've got the House of Lords. The Commons is relatively easy, but the Lords is much more difficult. The Lords is working very slowly through its business because of doing everything remotely, and its voting system has broken down and so on. So the Lords is more of a problem than the Commons.
And if there's an agreement, there absolutely has to be a bill before Christmas.
If there is an agreement, as far as I understand it, there has to be an implementing bill.
Well, Jacob, thank you very much for bearing with me and enlightening Con Home listeners with your views. And we'll be back, I hope, in 2 weeks. We'll find out then whether there's been a Brexit deal or not.
Indeed, thank you. Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.